Hey Tammy, what do you know about somatic therapy?
Let's fuck around and find out. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Fuck Around and Find Out, where every episode my husband Robert and I discuss different topics and you find out something new. I'm Tamala.
And I'm Bobbert.
And we're artists from the Pacific Northwest who have teamed up with Jason the Homie Blanks from A Narrative Media and historical voices from the East Side.
Last time you heard our lit review of My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menakin. Now you're listening to Part 2, Somatic Boogaloo, where we discuss some of our favorite practices and our experience with the book.
So just as a refresher, last time Robert and I talked about epigenetic trauma and generational trauma. Now, for those of you who don't know, or
if you didn't watch the last episode,
epigenetic trauma is the impact of a traumatic experience on not just one generation, but on subsequent generations after the event. When a person experiences trauma, there's a chance that the trauma can leave a chemical mark on a person's genes, which can then be passed on to future generations. And then we talked about generational trauma, right?
That's right.
We talked about how trauma retention exists in all kinds of bodies and how if we don't acknowledge the trauma that our ancestors have been through, we're just going to continue to run into problems for fucking ever.
Basically. If the idea of epigenetic trauma seems very new to you, consider how your body processes stress. Stress can cause gray hairs, heart disease, terrible skin just from the stress of not sleeping a proper amount.
In The Breakfast Club, Resma Menakin did an interview with them, and one thing that he brought to mind while I was still reading the book is, the Black community experienced 400 years of trauma, and then some. Imagine all of the cortisol, all of the, stress hormones that are released while they're having this trauma inflicted on them, and then it's being passed down to their children.
And those stress hormones that are still being held as it's being passed to your children. One of the questions that Resma Menakin asks in his book is for you to consider, what was it like for your grandparents? What experiences did they have that might be lingering in their bodies and passed to your body?
And what that's called is trauma retention. So when he talks about his grandmother being a sharecropper and having experienced, a very rough childhood, having been a sharecropper her entire life, he talks about how she used to whoop him and his brothers because she was experiencing trauma retention, and that was through whipping them.
And his book goes over how these expressions come out in sudden ways and how some of these expressions of these ancient stresses are trauma expressions and can relay trauma onto a next generation. So to combat that, Tammy, what is somatic abolitionism?
Somatic abolitionism, as defined by Resma Menakin, is an individual and communal effort to free our bodies from their long enslavement to white body supremacy and racialized trauma. And one of the ways that Resma Menakin offers to combat that is through somatic therapy, which is an alternative therapy that remedies trauma through bodywork and mindful practices.
If you tried mindfulness meditation and felt like it wasn't right for you, or felt that you weren't having the ability to reach the stillness that mindfulness meditation practices required, part of it may be an undiagnosed trauma that is making your body want to move, that is stopping you from reaching the headspace that's the relaxing and beneficial feeling. And this book has a lot of exercises that help you get through that body part, that will get you to the mind part. Tammy, what was your experience reading this book?
When I started reading this book, I knew absolutely nothing about trauma retention. I have trauma from my childhood, and when I was in 7th grade, I was diagnosed with stress-induced epilepsy and then later PTSD. But because my parents never got me treated, I didn't have the tools to cope or really understand what that meant. So into adulthood, I carried around not only this crippling anxiety I didn't know what to do with, but I realized I had emotional intelligence but weak regulation skills. So getting into this book, I felt a lot of anxiousness, mainly from Cassie telling me this book was going to be triggering. I couldn't imagine how this was going to move me, but I'm totally fine. I was already familiar with the study of epigenetic trauma, but then Mr. Menachem does a fantastic job breaking everything down to bite-sized pieces. I've not only learned how to process my trauma in a more productive way, but I've also learned more about my body. So, what was your experience reading this book?
When I read this book, it was very interesting following off of the other book, and other favorite book of mine, Nonviolent Communication.
By Marshall Rosenberg.
Yeah, by Marshall Rosenberg. Because that book talks about specifically trying to find the truth behind what someone else is saying. This book has a lot of practices for self-discovery, but reading through how trauma is processed in the body gave me a chance to understand that the actions of other people may be trauma responses that I would never have any idea of knowing, experiencing. The backgrounds that people have can be complete mysteries, but some of the actions bring out that there's a truth and a pain inside of them that will continue to show up and shine out depending on if that trauma has never been addressed. And this book helps me both see trauma in other people and the responses that can come from trauma within myself. Even if it's mild trauma such as stress and concerns of daily life, it gives you exercise routines and practices that are good for soothing, grounding, and reaching an area where you can approach these traumas with a mindfulness of acceptance and not trying to just, I don't like this feeling, I'm going to try to cut it out of me. That's what the book calls clean pain and dirty pain.
And you know, Robert, I think it's only fair that everyone knows that you have kind of been on this journey for a hot minute. Like, I wouldn't have read about nonviolent communication and subsequently My Grandmother's Hands if you hadn't already found that. And I remember it was during the pandemic, actually it was right before the pandemic. I was having a lot of anxiety about my job, and you said to read Nonviolent Communication and, you know, tell you how it feels. And that was kind of the beginning of my genuine healing journey. And, you know, I'm actually really proud that you were part of that.
And I'm proud to see how you've been, like, changing with accepting parts of yourself that for any given reason, like society, history, family, work, and school experience can say, hey, quick, you know that there's something alive in you? Well, we kind of need a dead person to just do menial tasks. So we prefer if you keep it to a very zombie state. And that's how, like, a lot of trauma goes unprocessed.
Yeah.
Horrible things can happen, and you have to get up and go to work tomorrow.
No, really, before I met you, that was exactly what my life was like. I was getting up at an ungodly hour and, you know, being exposed to a new, fresh kind of hell every time I went to work.
And so the biggest experience that this book gave me was recognizing clean pain and dirty pain.
Right. It's really about taking accountability for yourself in a way.
Because that's what clean pain is. It sounds like pain. It's in the name.
Yeah.
But clean pain...
It hurts to do, but it's so necessary.
Because it's the things that, like, they might be painful because embarrassment is a kind of pain.
Yes.
This is where the somatic part comes in, because these pains are feelings that will, like, catch in your throat through the, as the book describes, the soul nerve, which is the vagus nerve, which travels all the length of your body, mostly from your head down through your chest. It's what gives you feelings of butterflies in your stomach, a tightness or a lump in your throat. These are the pains that can come from being yelled at, from things that might not physically hurt. These are the real sticks and stones kind of words hurting you situations.
Yeah.
And approaching those as pain are how, when you get to the clean pain, when you address there is a pain, you can heal it. The dirty pain is when you go, you know, it's what you see online all over the place, which is someone's like, whoop, that wasn't what I meant to do, or, you know, this thing made me feel a certain way. I embarrassed myself. I made other people angry. And clean pain is addressing that anger and addressing that you might need to make things right with other people. And dirty pain going, no, it's the people who are wrong. I shall cover myself with mud and become invisible and staunch the wound with fresh layers of clay.
Yeah, and the book goes into great length about clean pain and dirty pain. He goes on to talk about how avoiding this truth is less painful than owning up to it, which explains why many Americans choose the dirty pain over the clean pain.
What you said is racially offensive. Hearing something like that, it gives a physical feeling because it is, like, as the book describes, and as psychologists will also say, words can cause fight or flight responses.
Yes.
And the book goes over the fight, flight, rest, freeze, and the last one, annihilate. And annihilate is the rare one, and one that the later half of the book describes, because this is the other part of the experience reading it that I was blindsided by and I didn't expect at all, is that there's a half of the book that is directed towards police officers.
Yes.
And you don't have to be one to read through this, but the way that he describes that, in the same way we just talked about having to wake up from a trauma and go to work the next day,
right.
Your last traffic stop may have been like something horrible and unmentionable found in a guy's trunk. Like you might have just stopped Ted Bundy, but now the next traffic stop you have to do is going to be like, a single mother who's really stressed out and late for her job, and she's giving you all kinds of attitude. Well, the Ted Bundy guy might have given you some attitude last time, and he was hiding too much stuff, and now she's reaching for her purse. Why is she reaching for her purse? And you just brought your trauma from the past back into this, and now gun violence accidents can happen.
Yes.
And that's something that this book covers as why these events and these traumas carry over in our police, and how these are, as the book describes, bodies. He doesn't use black people and white people. He describes through bodies because everybody has a body, and it reminds us that we're talking about bodies.
Yes.
People who can act and move.
Something that is tangible and present. Yeah.
And not the ephemeral people. Like, you go to work and you don't like dealing with people. You have to deal with people all the time.
Right.
But when you think of dealing with bodies, suddenly these people start to have a little bit more of a face and a shape than the mass known as people.
Yes, absolutely. I love that.
So, Tammy, what inspired you from this reading?
Oh my gosh. The validation of our habits within our community.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I love to research the diaspora for my webcomic, and I really fell in love with all of the stories that I came across, and the origins, and the meaning, and the next thing, You remember when I came screaming at you about laughing barrels?
It's funny because you had just shown me a video where it was someone asking the exact question, why do black people always look away and turn and run when laughing?
Yes.
And I was like, it's true, because I've known people who have done that, and it's not everyone. And it's not every black person, but there is a definite trend of that was funny. Even if it was something from like comedy movies or comedy on TV, there's like a recoil response that
when something
wasn't
is
looking
just
for it, but
too damn funny. You lean away, you try to hide your laugh, you try to laugh quietly. I found out what laughing barrels are, and it turns out that the reason that we do that, it's a somatic response from slavery. And so, of course, it's because of fucking racism, but, laughing barrels were a barrel that was supposed to, remedy the issue of slaves being beaten to death for laughing. Imagine you're hiring a bunch of poor white people to come onto your plantation and be overseers. They're poor and they're being exploited by the wealthy upper class. And so they're already kind of on edge, and then they hear slaves laughing. And they have the ability to beat the slaves to death. And so then it just kind of became this commonplace where, hey, if you get seen laughing, they're going to beat the crap out of you, possibly to death. And so they remedied that by putting barrels where people can run to and laugh in, because plantations were misery factories.
With a lot of slave owners and operators looking goofy as hell, just any given thing would be worthy of ridicule. But also, there's the need of trauma response to beat someone for laughing at you.
Right.
Is about a whole segment of what got them to America to begin with. There was a lot of things that white people saw in Europe that was traumatizing, so they brought that trauma with them.
And we're going to get into some of those things in our next episode on Tignon Laws.
So that's a very somatic response. It's retained, it's epigenetic.
Yeah, and if I had never read this book, I don't think I would have made that connection without telling myself first that I'm just imagining it or I'm making it up, because I see a lot of correlations between our history and things that are going on like within our community now. And I think, oh, that's probably something somatic. And then there's always that little voice of doubt that's like, oh, you're just, making connections where there aren't any. But this book really confirmed a lot of that intuition. So now when I feel that intuition that says you need to look into that, it is so much stronger, and it feels like I'm not crazy.
It having the validation that this isn't just within one body, that
Yes.
multiple bodies act this way, that there's cultures that have gotten us acting this way, and that some of these traumas over time blend in to be part of culture.
Yes, because when trauma is inhabiting a body and that trauma goes unaddressed, it starts to look like it's part of an individual's personality. But if it's happening to a community and that trauma goes unaddressed, it starts to look like culture. And epigenetic trauma genuinely leaves a somatic effect on the body. And, it's just as Mr. Menachem says, it looks like culture. So what about you, Robert? What inspired you in this reading?
Well, this is one of those books where the practices make sense, and it has practices that I feel like actually doing, as opposed to a lot of like psych books where most of the time they just go, now just meditate. Okay, that's the practice. I just told you to do one thing and I didn't really describe it. Buy my next 4 books in the series.
Yeah.
And like self-help books aren't really helping. This is probably it's not labeled as a self-help book, but you can certainly help yourself with these practices, because part of what the book goes over is trauma. So first, what's good for managing trauma? Finding out how to soothe yourself.
Yes, this book really helped me learn to identify that I'm having a reaction that is rooted in trauma retention. And it's been a journey. You can just take a step back and, reassess what is moving through my body that makes me want to move that way and why I want to move that way.
In terms of it's mindful, it's the ability to be doing one thing but have an awareness of your body. And through these somatic practices, it allows you a lot more control through the practice. If you've done any of the anchoring steps and practices, the body resting practices, he then brings up some practices that are less restful. They're the practices where you imagine being yelled at. You can imagine seeing things in front of you, things that would cause traumatic reactions, such as intense violence. Like what is in your body when you think of intense violence? And by going through the previous exercises and practices, soothing yourself, figuring out how to address your feeling so that you're not putting yourself into the center of them. You can work through them, you can accept the situation, and then act on it. Because if you've got too much holding you internally, you're not acting externally. You're too busy trying to put out your own fires. You might see something where you're like, someone should stop that, but I can't do it, I'm frozen.
Yes. And you know what I also like about those practices is that I'm not a religious person, but it is very religion inclusive.
Yes, the later chapter practices about cultural practices, about how to get the feeling of a church. And when I'm saying that, it's because he brings up that a lot of what people want in churches are things you can do outside of a church. The sense of community, things like cooking together, braiding hair together, and in a greater sense, like huge audiences swaying together, attending live music can be a religious-like experience because it's a crowd moving in a unison, swaying and humming together, a singular motion together. And this book goes over practices about developing a small cultural community that you can just set up. It really gives the exercises about how to work with multiple people in a very positive and culturally uplifting sense.
Yes, and I do believe that the key to success in a lot of our discussions about activism and social progress is community. And when we look at our history, we see that a lot of the communities of oppressed people have been systematically destabilized. And so we now live in a realm of capitalism where there's no reward for having a community.
No, in fact, you'll kind of get punished if your community is seen as like the wrong one, based on, well, it's not profitable for you to like sing and dance together. We need to make places where you pay to do that.
Exactly. So then it used to be that businesses were pillars of the community where people could hold meetings and talk about, how they were going to get access to voting and what is our education system like, and, things like that. And I think that the Black Panthers were kind of, and I know it's kind of romanticizing a very dark and difficult time for the African American community. However, the fact that the Black Panthers were out here feeding kids, getting people to and from their jobs, not really asking anything in return, but building up their community by just supporting each other in a non-transactional way, is how they made so much progress and eventually became a political party.
You might have seen or read shows, books, and movies that talk about the idea of a singular person combating their internal racism and solving hate crimes forever, or for what, all these things where it's like, yes, racism and your expression toward it is a personal journey, but other people are involved in it. And the idea that working with other people get a communal experience going, because part of the book is about getting a community that is somatic abolition centered. The idea that Black and brown and white bodies can be in the same environment, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's not that hard. That's all it takes to have a functioning society, is a bunch of people being in the same environment and having no problems working together and being with each other, because there's no cultural or tribalist divide separating it. So who would you recommend this book for?
I think it's actually really funny because the book, the introduction to the book identifies who shouldn't try to read it, but I'm gonna keep that to myself because I'm not gonna say who that person is here, so everyone buys the book and decides for themselves whether or not they're the kind of person who's ready, open, and receptive for this. Personally, I recommend it for any allies who are ready to do the work of an accomplice, or people who want to be more educated on how our history has impacted racial cultures, specifically those of the Black diaspora and European descendants. They're the ones who would benefit from this just as much as people that I'd recommend it for who are looking to learn more about their trauma and how to deal with that trauma. Especially trauma that has been inherited through their families, generational trauma, because that trauma was never meant to be yours in the first place.
To jump off with what you were saying in the beginning too, it really is, if you're not ready to start helping yourself,
right? How can you help
anyone else? You're not doing anything.
Yeah, and it really does put the ball in your court for people that say, well, I'm an ally. Okay, prove it. Do the work. And you need to be able to show people that you're an ally without you telling them that you're an ally.
If you're trying to make a claim for that, it should be self-evident. If you're
Absolutely.
About the only case where it makes sense is if you really are running up to someone who is currently in danger, going, I'm an ally, and then standing in front of them protectively or something. This book covers how to heal racialized trauma using the somatic methods, and that's important for anyone who's trying to do any advocacy work in any community.
Yeah, it's facing something that's happened historically and not taking it so personally when you hear people say you benefit from it passively, and that's why it's systematic, because it is a process that doesn't need your involvement in order for it to function. And when you hear those kinds of things and you're still having a reaction to it, you still have to process and do the work that is needed for your own healing so that you can help heal others.
Separating your body from the system is a way to recognize how you're getting something from the system in a way that will let you be very passive and comfortable. That's dirty pain.
Yeah.
Clean pain is recognizing that there are elements in the system that are made for you in a negative way to other people.
So, Robbie, who do you recommend this book for?
I want this in police reform yesterday. This book has the guideline for police training and removing the racialized trauma from police activity. I want it in the structure and foundation in our police reform because, yes, there are dangerous parts of the job of being a citizen serving your community in regards to its safety from threats and dangers, and you may be bringing in, if you work in that field, a lot of trauma of the last time you were in danger into this time, and the request that you are joining and going into danger, presumed real or imaginary, or you were told you were going into danger, but it's been over for 20 minutes, and now you're already hyped and, oh, it's not here, you're still looking for danger.
A lot of studies that we have about people who enter policing are people who have experienced poverty, who have experienced a purposeful lack of education because of that poverty, and redlining, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so, like, to a degree, to be a police officer, there is a very specific mindset that people have that is also perpetuating the danger, not only against themselves, but against the communities that they are policing.
If you're joining a community as a member of authority, you shouldn't be bringing in your own trauma because you are just going to be policing your trauma to other people.
And that's really why a lot of people say, police officers are just high school bullies.
Yeah, that's where the reform needs to happen.
That's where, personally, I would... I would do a little more than reform, but that's another episode for another day. So what was your favorite practice in this book, Robert?
My favorite practice, one of the first ones, and he doesn't really name any of these practices with catchy titles or anything, so he mostly puts them down as body practices.
Right.
So if you get to it within the first couple chapters, you know what it is. But
you found his favorite.
It's the practice where you take a length of a white rope or any kind of boundary marker you can find. Rope works because you can just throw a circle on the ground without having to draw it, paint it, or mess with it, and then just get into that circle.
It's just so easy.
It's so easy.
And all you have to do is imagine people who make you feel safe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The circle is about creating a territory for yourself.
Yeah.
And in our environments, that can be hard.
Yeah.
You might be listening to this in your car, at your workplace, or if you are at home, maybe you don't actually feel like you have a territory in any of those locations. It's why people get so protective of their cars. Why people get so protective of their environments is because they don't actually have a domain to claim in it. They're just kind of feeling like they are existing in it, and it's a very fragile sense. This is, you put a circle in the ground, that's your territory, that's your domain. For the minute, make sure it's the right place, but be safe in this space. Now you can start thinking about being outside of the space and the things that scare you outside of that space and the traumas that have happened to you outside of that space, processing it from a place of safety, of soothing. So when you cross that threshold outside of your circle, you're fresh, you're new, and the world isn't as scary because you've approached it yourself. You've made leaving the circle your choice, and that's giving you power back into your community to join it.
I also understand that there are people who have pets. And so, making any shape on the ground can be a little difficult without your cats, invading your space.
Make one for the cats. They get their right to territory. If they fit,
true.
they sit. So, make a circle for you and a circle for your cat. Now you've got a power animal.
Now you have a power animal. My favorite practice, I really like the breathing practices, but the chapter Assaulting the Black Heart has my favorite body practice. It asks you to remember yourself in a situation where you experienced a microaggression, then when you witnessed it happen to someone else. It's asking you to pay attention to how your body feels, and after you remember those situations, you then get to let it go. It's also a great chapter talking about self-hate in communities of culture, and I'm always looking to listen to anyone trying to rationalize that nonsense. In fact, The Conscious Lee does a video about self-hate that we should take a look at later on, which I also recommend to other people. The Conscious Lee is a fantastic creator who's out here doing the work.
So if you want to get a copy of My Grandmother's Hands, check your local library.
Check your local library.
It seriously is there. You most of the time can find it with, through the library apps. They have actually, if you have a problem reading books at all, most library apps let you change through a dyslexic-friendly font, and that might make all the world of difference for you.
It's true. There is a lot of accessibility for this book online, especially with the audiobooks.
Yes, the audiobook, as narrated by Carrie Height, is a very relaxing listen through for some very tough subjects at points.
Yes.
And that soothing voice can make all the difference. If you've got more of an experience with guided meditation or guided exercises, having him just playing the parts where he reads through them could be all you need to really get the most out of these practices. If you have issues just reading books in a paperback form, and especially books that have things like exercise and practices, I usually annotate my books to hell and back. This one is structured so well. It uses bullet points in all the right areas.
This hits my aesthetic cravings so hard. I'm just like, everything's so organized, and there's graphs.
There's graphs. It bolds important phrases. It italicizes text of importance.
It's an academic book, but it's written in such a way that literally anyone can pick it up.
It's very accommodating practices and writing.
Accommodating. That's what this is. It's accommodating.
It features my favorite phrase, as we mentioned, nonviolent communication.
Yes.
It does not use judgment language. It doesn't start off with racists are idiots. It's people who have trauma against black bodies likely have a trauma within themselves.
Yes,
Let's address how we can not be hurt by the hurt people and bring the hurt back into our communities to heal, instead of going, well, we just want to ostracize everyone who's against us.
Yeah, it's true. And I think that it gives a little more grace to people who are trying to get into these realms of advocacy and allyship. And, I do use a little harsh language when it comes to people who call themselves allies, and that is coming from a place of trauma. And I acknowledge that, and I do need to work on it.
As the subheader title of this book is, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway of Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. So, Tamala, where can people find you?
People can find me on TikTok and Instagram at Teenth Year Sun. I'll be uploading more podcast episodes here through Historical Voices from the East Side, where you can also find my friend Jason, who gave us this platform to share our ideas with you. If you want to see more from him, you can follow him on Twitch and other streaming platforms under History W. Thank you for joining us today as we begin this journey. We hope you get to grow with us. If you like this format, want to suggest a topic, or have any questions, leave a comment below, and be sure to subscribe so you can continue to fuck around
and find out.
I'm Tamala.
And I'm Bobbert.
Signing off.